Hello and welcome to the second reading of the Nei Jing Tu, or the Inner Pathway Diagram, or the Map of Your Inner Landscape in Taoist Meditative Practice. If you haven't seen the initial overview video yet, I would strongly recommend watching that first. It covers the main text within the document. It describes the three Nan and Tian, or the different areas of cultivation, as well as just a quick translation of some of the smaller indications within the scroll. The first overview translation is based on the work of Louis Commiati, who's a fairly well-known contemporary Taoist scholar. I used his translation primarily because the terms translate into English words that most people are comfortable with or familiar with as ways to, again, translate the Chinese. In this second video, or second reading, I'll be translating the document from the top down, and we're going to focus on understanding much more implicitly and thoroughly what it is that we're being asked to do conceptually, and I'll be giving some examples of things to try. In the third reading, which will be a 6-part course on Xiu Dao, or Taoist cultivation and building foundation, or Zhu Ji, we'll be doing the translation from the bottom up, and again, that's going to be a course, and it's going to take probably about 3 months to go through all of it. And I wouldn't really recommend doing that unless you're an experienced meditator and fairly comfortable within the Taoist paradigm. So again, in this video, we're going to be going from top down, and I'll be translating it more or less word for word, or concept for concept as we go through it. And given my background, which you can learn about in the first video, I'll be translating the Nei Jing Tu within the tradition I studied in, which is called the Yida Huanyuan tradition, which is a village tradition from southern China. And the focus is on returning to the source through the practice of medicine, Yida Huanyuan. And because of that paradigm or approach to Taoist practice, the initial thing that we're always focusing on is how that helps us, our patients, or people in general, heal, and not just in the sense of heal from, say a sprained ankle, or out of balance liver and kidneys or something, but to heal much more on the existential level, the spiritual level, and the balance of our nature as human beings. I hope that perspective on Taoist cultivation gives you some other insights if you're already a practitioner, and if you're new to Taoist meditation or Xiu Dao, I guess I'm just giving you a sense that I'll be speaking to this from healing and then more spiritual practice, and then where Taoist practice eventually gets to. Perhaps the most concise way to bring your awareness to what Taoist meditation, Taoist practice is, beyond just self-cultivation in the sense of your well-being, either tends towards what's called Nei Dan, or inner alchemic work, or working with an energetic interaction within your experience within your body, that is considered to be an elixir, or something that is beyond the mundane. And if you're not familiar with that idea, I would encourage you to look into it, because there's quite a lot to the Nei Dan tradition. The tradition I learned in is more what is called Tiantai or Xiantai, which has to do with a celestial embryo or immortal embryo. And those words in English are kind of literal and imply something maybe a little bit beyond what's actually meant in the Chinese. But similar to working with the idea of an elixir or an alchemic practice where you're kind of making something happen within a region of your body or your experience, or perhaps the universe, the inner embryo practices are very similar. It's just not so much focused on the material and the transformation within the relationship to the material. It's much more about the ground, the environment, and what's going on sort of through the practice, perhaps more than what's happening within the practice. And I guess I'm making those distinctions more separate than they really are, but just in case you're already in one of those two traditions, just giving you a chance to giving you a sense of where I'm coming from. And of course, if you're new to these things, it might be interesting to go and look up the Nei Dan practice, the celestial embryo practice, and just get a sense of where these traditions come from and what they're focused on. And perhaps one final invitation would be, if you're not familiar with Taoist cosmology, Taoist ontology, which you can sometimes find in Chinese medicine textbooks or blogs online, or perhaps YouTube videos online, I would also encourage you to look into that a little bit. It's a bit more involved than just yin-yang and wuxing, or 5 phases, and the idea of the 3 treasures, or jing qi shen. There's many layers to the cosmology of the indigenous people of Asia, or the Taoist kind of cultural paradigm. And having a sense of those layers and how they're all present at the same time, but have different influences within your experience right now, within perhaps the influences they have throughout the course of your life. Having a conscious relationship with each of those layers of what is perhaps the Taoist universe may give you a better sense of what some of these things mean, because that's what a lot of the terminology refers to. So I hope you're ready to dive in, because we're going to begin with the second reading, translating the document from the top down. So beginning with that, of course, is the title, and in Chinese documents, especially the older ones, they are written from and read from right to left. So as we go through some of these things, we'll be reading them from right to left and then top down, which can make some of the translations confusing if you're not aware of that and trying to translate it on your own. So we have Nei Jing Tu. Nei means inward, inner, not subtle, the boundary between what is sort of overt or obvious in the world, and the boundary between what is very subtle and nuanced. And perhaps in a more spiritual sense, the boundary between the mundane and the sacred, or the experience of separation and belonging, unity, and non-separation. So that's the context of inner work, is all of those things. Jing can mean a classic, like a book. It can mean your meridians. It can mean the fabric of space-time. It can mean the pathways on any kind of map, or in the topography of a landscape and things like that. And Tu just basically means diagram, map, scroll, or something like this. So the Nei Jing Tu is a scroll, map, or diagram of the pathways, energy systems, fabric of space-time as you experience it as an embodied, conscious, life form. And we really want to be, as practitioners, curious about moving through the layers of the obvious to the subtle, the mundane to the sacred, the separate to the unification, or the experience of unification, or realization, or enlightenment, or I hope you have that experience and come up with a really good word for it, whatever that might be for you. So that's the title, and that's the implication. So let's begin translating the text from the top down. So the reason why, when we're teaching this document, in at least the tradition that I was raised up in, the reason we begin at the top of the head is that most of us are engaged in these practices because we are aspiring to spiritual cultivation, which in some ways might be considered healing the heart, the mind, and soul. In other ways, they also imply the aspiration to either something beyond our normal conscious experience, or probably more accurately, at least in what I've learned, is something below or behind what our day-to-day conscious experience might be. In Chan or Zen meditation, we often refer to that as the unborn mind. There's the you that's you, and then there's the you that makes you possible, that you may or may not ever meet, depending on how much meditation you do. So we have this aspiration, our highest aspirations above the head, to connect to what's coming down from the sky, what we may think of as heaven or happening in heaven, depending on the culture you're in. So the first thing that we experience here is called Yan Shou, which can be translated roughly as the practice of things that help you with longevity, the things that have to do with the cycles and the patterns within life. And given the understanding of that, especially if you're cultivating, your consciousness in hopes of liberation or something like that, each of us has our proverbial bank account or gas tank or reservoir of our potency of aliveness. And we want to choose how much of that resource, or I guess fuel in the tank, we spend in different ways in our life, in our work, in our other practices, so that we have more than enough to accomplish what it is that we're setting out to in this practice. So, that can relate to the seasons, it can relate to even your family's medical history, in the sense of what you have to expect or rely on for the time you have, and the energy you have, and the focus you have to engage in all of these relationships, so that you can return to Tao. The next thing here we call Xian Fo, which Xian is often translated as immortal, and Fo would be the Buddha mind or Buddha nature. So when we think of immortal, obviously that's not meant to be taken literally. It's someone who has cultivated an experience of aliveness, or being alive, or being life, that is beyond a fear of death. The character is actually the people who live in the mountains, or the mountain folk, and there's a lot of attributions in early Taoist literature to the indigenous people, sometimes referred to as Zhenren, or the true human beings, which is a common name amongst indigenous people around the world, is the authentic human beings, because we're human beings. So to be Xian, to be immortal, I would say, in the way I would translate it, that as to be wholeheartedly mortal, to be completely alive in your life, because you're aware you may die, and if you're awake to your death, then you're actually truly alive. So Xian doesn't mean you're going to live forever, although some people take it that way in some ways, and why not? In the way that I was taught, and the way I would encourage people to think about it, though, is to come to a place in life where you are living, I wouldn't say fearlessly, because that just sort of really has to do with, risk and things like that. But to live with a kind of humility and playfulness and humor, knowing that, today is today, and it's a good day to live, and in some traditions you might say a good day to die, which means your aliveness is that much more precious, your practice is that much more worth and worthy of your complete attention. So that's where we start with these highest aspirations. So just below these highest aspirations are a series of quotes and reminders that have to do with certain sacred truths that are implicit to Taoist culture, Taoist cultivation. And you might say, in the sense of myth, what it is that we're going to encounter in the depth of our practice, as well as myth in the sense of old stories that tell us what's happened to some of the more revered or well-known participants in this practice. They can go back hundreds or even thousands of years. So the first one that we see coming from the top down describes how the entire universe can be seen or held through a grain of millet. And this relates to a story about one of the more revered Taoist practitioners, Lu Dongbin, who's sort of the forefather of one of the lineages that I've studied in, if not probably almost every living Taoist practitioner today. Although I don't think he would ever have called himself a Taoist, he was focused on Xiu Dao, the cultivation practices, more than the idea of an ism or a belief system, and was a very prolific researcher and writer. And there's a story about him when he was still living in his mundane life, wanting to become a administrator. And in China at that time, if you could read and write and take a test and pass the test, you could basically be guaranteed a job and enough wealth to have a courtyard and a family and all of the things. So he was, as many spiritual stories go, we have to make that decision between, taking care of business down here on the ground with, money and bills and things, or perhaps living more as a recluse or in a monastery, or finding, hermits and magicians and sages and shamans to study with, which usually doesn't mean living in a townhouse. So that's even true today. So in this story, Lu Dongbin is doing one of the things that Taoist cultivators do, which is to travel around and stop at various inns, because there was graffiti often written on the walls of these inns that was sort of sacred poetry, or directions where to find a really revered sage, or often diagrams and stuff like that that gave people some insight on what they're up to as practicing Taoists. But it's also a lot of famous stories of people traveling around and finding these roadside inns, and then of course meeting the sage or the hermit or the shaman, as over a bowl of soup. And magical stories ensue. So here's a very quick version of this story. Lu Dongbin goes to the inn, sits down to have a bowl of gruel, which is sort of symbolic of being poor, or in sort of the lower part of the story of your practice, and meets some sage who sits down, and he's looking into the bowl of this millet congee or gruel, staring at one grain, and goes through the dream of his entire life as if he had passed the test, become an administrator, gained wealth in the family, the children, the nuances, just think of your favorite soap opera of all the things that could go right and wrong with wealth, family, and working for the government or something. And then he comes out of the reverie of his dream, staring at his bowl of gruel, comes back to seeing the sage, and the sage, of course, in the story witnessed his dream, and then invites him, given what that life would have been like and perhaps worth, as you may compare what you choose to do with a life, that perhaps the life of cultivation and research and practice would be a vaster and more profound adventure than just working for the government and having a family. And that's sort of a common theme in many stories throughout Taoist history. But this is the one that is always referred to. And the reason why we have it referred to there, and especially with this little dot here at the top of the head, is that there are parts of our conscious experience that, if you've ever taken, say, magic mushrooms or other substances like that, that has the innate capacity for visionary experience. So when we think of this millet dream, not only are we invited to consider what we choose to do with our lives, and whether or not we choose to commit 100% to practice, or fit it in within a mundane career, it's also an allusion to certain aspects of practice without substances or with substances. You can have visionary experiences that can profoundly change the trajectory and the meaning of your life, and that those will happen in your practice if you do all of these things in the appropriate way long enough. And those insightful visionary experiences, I think, are true across all cultures, especially indigenous cultures. And I'll probably keep saying this, but Taoism is what's left over of the indigenous cultural practices of Asia, or we now call China. So many indigenous cultures are very focused on breathwork, drumming, using medicine plants and different kinds of teachings to induce these visionary states, even profound fasting. So great story, but also maybe a little bit of a warning, a yield sign. If you don't really want to engage in a spiritual tradition and practice that may rely on the experience of and the meaning of and perhaps the result of profound visions, perhaps you don't really want to go any further, because that's inevitably what's going to happen if you interact simultaneously in all the ways that are indicated in this chart or scroll. There is one other implication to the millet dream that I think I want to speak to quickly before I move on, and that has to do with an aspect of meditation I think that is true to most meditation traditions, especially Chan and Zen, who are very confident about a one-pointed focus, say on lower dantian, on a spot on the wall, or looking through the bottom of a well, which I'll speak to in a while, or many other things where we're looking at one point or feeling into one point of our existence, and also looking through it, because there's this perception and or concept in Taoist practice of the mystery gate, or the gate beyond the profound. And in order to move beyond the profound, or what I often refer to as beyond the profound undoing, it isn't that we focus on one point, it's that we focus on one point to move beyond the one focusing on the point to what is beyond what mundane attention can actually do. And this implies what is called apophetic meditation, which is a kind of meditation that begins with the admission that your conditioned mind is not in any way prepared for, aware of how, or has any knowledge of how to accomplish what it is that you're doing with your practice, which is kind of like jumping off of a diving board in a certain way. And I'll use that metaphor in a few other ways as well. So the next thing we want to become aware of is this quote here, right next to the Millet Dream quote. And it says, Ni Wan Gong. And that basically means the mud, pill, or concentration palace or meeting place. So when we talk about the mud ball, in one sense we're just talking about the brain. In another sense, similar to the millet grain, we're talking about the pineal gland, or the part of the brain that produces a connection to the source. And again, if you've gone through a review of, or you're aware of Taoist cosmology and the manifolds or the layers of conscious existence, mud, being the primordial ooze, is a symbol of moving from the part of you that exists in this form, in this incarnation as this self, who is also connected very directly to what is primordial to you. And this relates to what is called Hun and Pa, or different aspects of your soul, your genetics, your character, and many other aspects of your experience of yourself. But also it implies that with certain kinds of practices, what I guess in contemporary life you might consider to be like dream work and things, though that's not what this is talking about. We have a chance to interact with the collective unconscious, or perhaps the soul that is moving through you before it became you, which, one might consider the possibility that the soul that's peeking through you is kind of like the hand reaching into a glove. The experience you have of life is all about the glove, but it's only possible because of the hand, but the hand is connected to something more than just the hand. And if we want to work with the aspects of being a being beyond the individuated self, or the non-self being, one way to do that is to experience the mind and all of the cultivation we're doing within Qing, and the spinal column, and the bone marrow, and the brain, which is the sea of marrow, and how all of that refinement implies a refinement of the mud, a clarification of, if we shake up silt and water, the silt sinks and we see clear water. So as we clarify and refine the Qing, which is a part of Taoist alchemic practice, we also, you could say, have a clearer view or window, or perhaps a clearer reflection or mirror of what it is that's moving into and through your conscious experience from what is before the individuated you. So the next thing in our sacred wisdom to consider is called Shengyang Fu. And this basically means, Sheng is to rise upwards, and in the context of spiritual practice, means what it's like to ascend. Now, that can be taken very literally, in the sense of almost like being abducted by aliens. You're in the world down here, and then you ascend to the spaceship or wherever aliens might go. So we can take that idea literally, or we can think of the idea of ascension as, again, moving from the mundane to the sacred, from the knowable to beyond the knowable. And we talk about ascending yang relating to spirit, to consciousness. And Fu doesn't always mean palace. It can also mean a sacred residence, or perhaps if you have a room in your house that you practice in, that room would be Fu, because it would be the place where the most meaningful, the most sacred things happen, and or the place if you sit. Often, just one moment. This is a meditation bench that I made when I was 17 years old, when I did a 10-month daily meditation practice in Nei Gong, or Chan practice, and that was 37 years ago. So in a way, this bench is full, because it's the place, or the residence, or the place my practice has resided for many, many years. So there's another implication with this besides just the idea of ascending, because that can sometimes give people the perception that our objective here is to leave. And that is actually, I would say, maybe 20% of contemporary Taoist perspective, and even more so within kind of the Middle Ages, where the belief was that you could become an immortal and go and leave your body and take your immortal spirit or your immortal embryo and live with the immortals in the sky. And that's a thing humans have been trying to parse out for a very long time. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that the poise, the perception, the imminent purpose of ascension is something you can embody. It's something you can hold in your meditation. Quite often, different teachers that I've had sitting in practice, they wouldn't talk about all the big picture stuff. They would talk about the presence, the posture, the poise, the balance of the position of pretty much every muscle, joint, and nerve and bone, and how your eyes and your ribs and your diaphragm and your pelvis and perineal floor create a specific kind of resonance that is the imminence of waiting for the next aha, without any projection as to what that aha might be. So when we talk about the residence of ascending yang, we're also talking about the lodge, if you will, of the body, the residence of how we actually kind of arrange the furniture, within the structure of our practice. So that comes up actually in several other places and in much more specific directed detail as to how to formulate and or reorientate all of your body's tissues, especially your spine, to have that ascendant yang feeling within the poise of your posture. So over here we have this little quote. This is Jiu Fang Shan, which is the 9 mountain peaks, if you will. And you can see there are several mountain peaks across the head. And this can be taken a lot of different ways. And I've seen probably half a dozen different translations as to what that 3 words actually implies. And, I didn't write this document, so it's anyone's guess as to what the original author was actually really meaning to suggest. But the 9 peaks can relate to some aspects of cultural symbolism that go back to one of the earlier texts that this is based on, called the Huang Ting Qing, or the Yellow Court Classic. It can relate to other teachings around what are called the 9 palaces. There is one other teaching that relates to Dantian. There's 1 Dantian, then there's 3 Dantian, then there's 6 Dantian, then there's 9 Dantian. So that's another way to look at it. My favorite way of looking at it is, when I'm sharing this with people, is consider this to be a 9-year project, or perhaps a 9 sequences of transformation, which I'm not going to try and delineate in some way. But just in the sense of this might take a while, and there's probably some humps and valleys along the way, and you're going to have to go over the ups and downs of your practice and the gradual dissolution of the attaching ego to the aspiring what if of consciousness. And by giving ourselves the hopefully humorous, ups and downs and maybe years and maybe layers perspective, we'll be much more gentler and more in the moment with, you could say the topography and the weather of your practice, as opposed to believing that you actually have any sense or way to articulate or know the outcome, or even what the next thing you might unfold will be. So a few metaphors there to hopefully give you some, time and enjoyment, because it seems to be a good idea if you're going to do this for the rest of your life. So up here at the very top of the spine, we have the quote, Zhu Feng Ding, which can be roughly translated as the apex or the summit of an immense or very tall peak. Now, when we think of that, we might think of, Mount Everest and the top of the peak of the highest mountain. Or, so I think someone once said Hawaii is taller than Everest if you look at it as a volcano from the seafloor to the top. So it doesn't really matter the place, because it isn't describing a place. It's describing a topography or a shape or a quality, again, of how we actually arrive over and over and over again in the embodiment of our practice. And we think of our spine, and this might be a strange thing to place here, so I hope this isn't too distracting. But imagine that, this meditation tradition says you always have to have a cup of tea or a bowl of soup or really hot soup, sitting on top of your head, so that as you go into meditation, a part of the practice is to be this immense or continuing to go upwards peak or summit, in the way that we align our spine, the way we sit in our practice. Now that can also become rigid, so we're not looking to just stretch our spine and try and touch the roof with the top of our head. We're trying to find this balance between upward and downward, yin and yang, which will eventually help us refine the interaction between the Ranmai and Dumai, the main meridians in the microcosmic orbit, which there's a lot to talk about with that. And in fact, that's one of the underlying implications within the Nei Jing Tu, is one traditional perspective on what that practice is and how to approach it. So, another thing to feel and become, as well as know a little bit about. There's a practice I'll speak to more when we get down into here that has to do with true soil and imitating a mountain over eons of time, with respect to what is called true soil or Zhen Tu. And there's a few aspects to that practice, but if you were to take a moment and imagine that you are, this immense mountain, and some part of you is aspiring upwards, the way a mountain peak seems to be, reaching up and through, over years and years and years, imagine what's going to happen to the connective tissue between the top of your head and the rest of your body, or your seated posture if you sit in meditation, and how all of that change over time is going to take time, but how that change in the way you hold yourself together, keep it together, keep going, or whatever metaphor for being stressed out might fit in. That's going to be one of the transitional capacities or reorientations of your experience. Because if you are an uptight person, I've been an uptight person a lot in my life, if I'm uptight, like keep it together, I'm not actually up like the peak of a mountain, feeling the rain, cascade across my surface over tens of thousands of years. I'm just getting through the next 5 minutes. So up and tight is not going to help us. So we have to have some quality of upward that is balanced profoundly by the softening, melting, releasing, and letting go and letting through, and anchoring and sinking downwards with all aspects of our being. And you can see people's postures change, usually within 2 to 3 years of practice, where their whole body becomes very lithe, very bamboo-like up and down, because they're not sitting with their forehead against the future trying to win at some battle. We're trying to come into state, and that's an embodied, conscious, yin-yang balance that's always changing. It's never the same. So the next one here, sitting over this interesting little object here, is translated as, or in Chinese is Yu Luo Ling Tai, and this can be translated roughly as this is often translated as the thickly meshed net that we cast off the terrace, or kind of point of vista, almost like a balcony that we cast into the numinous. Now, numinous, if you're not familiar with that term, kind of means something that you can't actually know, but is implied, through the nature of creation itself. It's sort of like just on the edge of understanding it in a way, but it's also a part of Chinese culture. It's a part of many indigenous cultures, and the character Ling is actually 3 female shamans singing to bring down rain, so that the people can be healthy and live and grow food and stay alive. So this idea of Ling in Taoist cultivation goes way back into early indigenous culture in China, but it still implies that somehow human beings down here on the ground have capacity through practice, through ceremony, through singing, through other avenues that have been practiced around the world by almost every culture in some way. The implication is you can communicate in some way with creation, with ancestors, with the numinous, with Tao, or God, if that's a part of the paradigm you experience. So when we think of this terrace, this balcony, this place we can kind of wander out to or stand up on top of, and I once had a kind of visionary experience where I was standing on top of one of the pyramids that looks like the ones in the Mayan temples, and don't take any of this literally, it was a visionary experience, but when you're standing at the top of those things, you're kind of at the apex of the tall mountain. And what do you do there at the apex of the tall mountain? You have your posture, you have your presence, you have the balanced up down, you're doing all the things, you've been at it for a long time. And when we say casting a thickly meshed net, in some way we're kind of reaching into the collective unconscious for visions, dreams, information, inspirations, intuitions that may help move obstacles within the way our mind has been conditioned, or may give us an insight about the meaning of things, or may help us, reflect on something that helps us understand, have compassion, or a deeper willingness, if you will, to move through something. And that's a big part of meditation, is moving through your conditioned self, moving through visceral, instinctual, existential patterns of holding and defensiveness, constraint, collapse, and many other parts of our experience that are held. So we can't just decide to make them go away. When you get a car wash, it doesn't clean the entire car inside and out. It just gets rid of the dust and mud on the outside. So the implication here is that we cast that net into the unknowable. We are hoping to receive something that inspires a change in what we know or understand or believe to be true about ourselves or about life. And that's kind of high risk, high reward, in the sense that what if you get, an affirmational experience or a dream that undoes a whole bunch of the things that you've been standing on, which is kind of a bit of the choke. And there's a lot of really good double entendre kind of puns in this document, because if we're on this terrace or on the top of this pyramid casting a net into the unknowable to find something of meaning that may rock our world in some way, well, that's a good thing to do. Interestingly, on the other side of this way of translating this document, a thickly meshed net is another way of describing a hammock. And a hammock, being a well-woven thing, allows us to sit on our balcony, or perhaps the top of a Mayan pyramid, in the repose of ease and complete relaxation. And one of my teachers even had said this: perhaps the idea is to relax so much that you fall through the holes of the hammock. And become one with the nebulous, or the unknowable, or the Ling, because it's before form. So if you want to relax through a hammock, you have to relax quite a lot, in the sense of becoming like water. And that doesn't just mean physically relaxing. That means just letting go of all of the subterfuge and aspirations and wants and projections of spiritual practice. And there's another little, subtle implication here, is they could have said, and this is maybe making a bit of fun of certain Western tendencies, they could have said, walk the tightrope between the mundane to the sacred. But instead they said, cast a net into the ocean and see if you catch a fish, based on what I had just said. Or just lay in a hammock and soften until you turn into the primordial ooze yourself. So there's a lot of ways to look at this. And that's the fun of translating these documents, and play with them all, because if you're hoping for the one right answer, that's kind of an uptight way to go about translating something that's meant to be suggestive of what it's like to go through transformation, ascension, layer by layer by layer. So who knows what the next layer is, who knows who you're going to be then, and beyond and beyond and beyond. And that's all often why I refer to the practice of this Xiu Dao as beyond a profound undoing. So we can't know, and we're undoing something, so we can't know. So maybe we can just focus on different ways to orient ourselves to the practice, with a sense of humor, a smile, hopefully a full belly, and a very open and apex-like reaching spine with a lot of cascading rain washing the debris off the surface of your embodied mountain-like meditation experience. So in translating this top down, it would make sense for me to go over here, but I'm going to speak to the things that are on the front of the face of the person sitting here, if we can be so bold as to decide this is the person sitting here. Instead, though, I'm going to go down and speak to the aspects that are happening here at the back of the neck, and then inside the base of the spine, the base of the brain, into the spine, into the throat, into the chest, because these are very, very practicable, practical aspects of Qi Gong, Nei Gong, Nei Tian. And they have a lot of important meaning. And because I'm a clinician, professor person who's always talking to people about health in the body and physiology, I am going to speak a little bit to a couple of neurological conditions about being a human being with a nervous system that also are very clearly pointed out in the way that this document is drawn and in the characters that are here, or the statements that are here. Obviously they didn't know about these modern neurological things back in the day, but they experienced them, and they experienced the difference between the mundane and the sacred, the conditioned, and the undoingness of the self. So we'll come back to that in a moment.